Esther chapter 4. Excited about everything we've got coming up. I forgot to turn those lights on, didn't I? So, we've got a lot of neat things coming up over the next few weeks. This coming Sunday, our children's ministry is going to be doing our worship songs and everything for us, and then I'll be preaching from an extremely familiar passage of Scripture, John chapter 3, 16, all the way down through 21, as we talk about the gift of Christmas and the true meaning of what Christmas is all about. So then on the 20th, we'll have our Christmas service that morning. We'll have the in-gathering that will take up the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. We'll be able to place all of that over in the manger. Then that evening at 5 o'clock, we'll have our singing and candlelight and all of that stuff that we're going to be doing here. And then right after that, we'll be going next door for a kind of a finger food type meal. The church will be providing everything again for that. So we don't have to, A, we don't have a lot of hands to touch it, and B, that way you guys can come and feel safe throughout every bit of that. And so I'm just excited. I'm excited about the Christmas season. I can't believe that it's already on us like it is. It just doesn't seem real, but there hasn't been very much of 2020 that has seemed real. And so, hey, we just take it with stride as we go. So every story, or every movie, I guess you could say, if any of you that like to watch dramatic movies and things, I'm more of the comedy guy, but some people like to watch dramas. Well, every drama, it seems it has this big suspense that builds in the middle, and then there's always this kind of a turn of events that takes place, and then generally, in order to make it a good drama, there is some surprises that come to the end. Well, I can't think of any better way to describe what is taking place with the Book of Esther. And tonight is what I would simply call that big build-up of suspense and that turn of events. And we'll kind of leave it in the suspense mode a little bit tonight, but just remind you kind of where we've come from. Chapter 1 took place in the third year of the reign of King Xerxes, and it was at a time when they were preparing to go and try to capture Greece, and Queen Vashti was the queen at that point in time. And remember, there was this whole display and all of this stuff, these banquets that they did, trying to show their wealth off and everything, and then Queen Vashti refused to have herself paraded in front of a group of drunken men, and because she refused that, remember the leaders there, the ones that were the advisors for King Xerxes, encouraged him to send her off, and that's what he did. She was banished. She's never allowed to come to the citadel of Susa again. Well, then you got into that second chapter, and we've been talking the whole time about the sovereign hand of God and how this is working. And in the second chapter, we find we fast-forwarded 4 years, so it went from year 3 to year 7. And as we fast-forwarded those 4 years, remember, in between that was Persia's failed invasion of Greece. And so after that failed invasion, King Xerxes comes back, and he's sitting kind of moping around like you can imagine he would do. And so all of his leaders that are around him decide that they're going to put together the Miss Persia beauty contest, which is basically what that was. They gathered all the virgins from all the provinces, the 27 provinces of Persia, and they brought them into the citadel of Susa, and they was going to put them through a year of beauty treatments and oils and all of these type things. And Esther, her real name was Hadassah. She is a Jew. And Hadassah was brought in as part of that. And Because she was a Jew, she was forbidden to really buy Mordecai, which we'll talk more about him, but Mordecai, which was her uncle who had taken her in. Apparently her parents had both passed, and so he had kind of taken her in and raised her. And Mordecai kind of forbid her to reveal her nationality, and so she went by Esther. And Esther won all of the hearts of everybody that literally was in the entire citadel, and including the heart of King Xerxes. And she was crowned as the new queen. And then we got to meet a guy by the name of Mordecai. And as I told you, Mordecai would be the uncle of Esther. And he was also a Jew that had been part of the Babylonian captivity. They did not leave the captivity. They stayed there when Persia took over Babylon. And so Mordecai's there, and Mordecai kind of overhears an assassination attempt that's about to take place against King Xerxes. So he now has an inroad inside the citadel with Esther, and he is able to inform Esther of what's going on. Esther then in turn informs the king. They realize the plot, that it's true, and those two officials are executed. And then we fast forwarded to when we got into the 3rd chapter. We fast forwarded another 5 years to the 12th year of the reign of King Xerxes. And in the 12th year of the reign of King Xerxes, we find a guy by the name of Haman. Haman has, and I used the word wormed last week, and I think that's probably an appropriate way to say it, but Haman had wormed his way into the highest position outside of King Xerxes in all the citadel of Susa. He was the second in command, and he let pride go to his head. And because he had such a lofty position, he wanted everybody to bow down to him. When he came in and out of the gates, he expected everybody to bow down. Well, the problem, there was a guy at the gate by the name of Mordecai. And Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. It wasn't really out of disrespect for Haman, although that's how Haman took it. It was because he was a Jew, and a Jew does not bow to anyone but God. Well, Haman finds out about Mordecai and how he is, but he also finds out that he's a Jew. And remember, I talked to you last week about one of the things you need to know about Mordecai is the fact that he was an Agagite, and we read from 1 Samuel 15, the story of when the priest, when King Saul was supposed to have had literally left nothing unturned in the war, and yet he captured the king of Agag, and instead of putting him to death, put him in prison. And so when the prophet comes through and realizes everything that's taken place, and he chastises King Saul because King Saul did not do what God had told him to do. And you remember, kind of ended with the story of where the prophet has the king of Agag brought forward, and he is killed right then, as God had instructed Saul to do. Well, because the Jewish priest did this, the Agagites absolutely hated the Jews. And so when Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, he sets up this entire plan to have the entire Jews eradicated. All the Jews in the citadel of Susa, that's hard to say. All the Jews in the citadel of Susa, he puts an edict together, and he takes it before King Xerxes. And I told you, be careful who you listen to, because King Xerxes gives the signet ring, which is basically his seal, gives the signet ring to Haman, and has this edict put into place. We ended kind of last week with this edict as it's being sent out over all the provinces, and it said that all the Jews were in uproar. Well, that brings us to this 4th chapter. This 4th chapter doesn't have a time lapse like the other ones do. This happens literally immediately after this. And kind of the way we know that is because there's only a year between the edict and when it's going to be fulfilled. And so everything that we have through the end of the book of Esther is all taking place in this time there. So let's pick up with the fourth chapter, because the fourth chapter is the pivotal chapter in the book of Esther. The fourth chapter contains the most famous verse that is in all the book of Esther. It's a verse that if you've ever studied the book of Esther, they always talk about this one verse. But let's get into this. There, in verses 1 through 3, it reminds us that there is this time of mourning. And I want us to read it together. It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, this is when he heard about the edict, it says that he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. In Esther's day, it was common to put on a very loose-fitting, dark-colored goat skin, very coarse goat skin sack when you were in a time of mourning. They also would go and they would take ashes and literally throw them all over themselves. There's a lot of thought as to why they did this, but the biggest reason that I could ever come up with is because they wanted to present themselves, as lowly, but they also presented themselves almost as if they were unclean before God, because in the midst of their humility, that is what was taking place there. They were mourning. There was incredible wailing that took place all over the citadel of Susa. And interestingly enough, it didn't only take, it wasn't only the Jews that were wailing. Remember, the Jews had integrated themselves into the first Babylonian and now the Persian lifestyle. They, while they were not Persians, and they certainly were not Babylonians, they had integrated themselves, and at this point in time, up until what Haman's trying to do at least, they were not being treated badly. They had kind of incorporated themselves into the customs of the Persians, with the exception of in their religious beliefs. And so it wasn't just the Jews that were upset over this edict. There was people everywhere. You can imagine at those times you made friends with people who may have been Jews at that time, and so it wasn't uncommon. And so then you found out that one of your friends falls under this edict that is about to take place. And so there was a great deal of turmoil and upheaval that was taking place in all the provinces there in Susa. But mainly, especially with the Jews, you can imagine that if an edict was set down that said 1 year from this date, you were going to be taken out into the street and you were going to be murdered, and there's nothing you can do about it and no way you can escape from it, which is basically what the edict said. I don't know about you, but I would probably be slightly upset at that as well. We all have our own ways to mourn, and I'm not sure that I'd have put goat hair on and thrown ashes on myself, but I guarantee you we would have cried. I would have huddled my family together. We would have, you would begin to do these things because when you're thinking about your own mortality and thinking about the fact that death is now imminent and you have been told this is when you're going to be murdered, well, it puts a whole new perspective on life. And so there is this incredible time of mourning that takes place. But what's interesting and what we're going to find out is there is a major disconnect between what takes place in the provinces and what takes place literally inside the citadel. Because inside the citadel, if you remember last week, it kind of ended by saying that, the Jews began to wail and were upset about this, but Haman and King Xerxes began to drink and have a merry time. Well, the reason for that is, there was a major disconnect between what took place inside the citadel compared to what took place in all the provinces. Kind of like we see today. You know, there's a major disconnect between, do as we say, not as we do, many times from our politicians. They want to tell us what shoes to live in, yet they refuse to live in those shoes themselves. It's the same thing that happens in the Citadel. And because of that, we're going to find in just a second that not only is there a disconnect with Xerxes and Haman, but there's an actual disconnect with Esther. Esther has not been able to have as many conversations with Mordecai. She does not know what this edict is. She has no idea the upheaval that's taken place just outside the gates. And so because of that, and this is verses 4 and 5, and I want us to kind of look at what happens in verse 4 and 5. So it says, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathak, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. There is a disconnect there. Can you imagine the upheaval that has taken place, and the queen does not even know what's going on? There is such a difference between what is taking place inside the palace there or inside the citadel compared to what's taking place just outside those gates. And so with everything that's taking place, Esther is totally unaware. So you get now into verses 6, 7, and 8, and what you find is after Hadassah or Esther sends Hathak to find out, all right, Mordecai, why are you in this mourning? I want you to hear what Mordecai says. This starts in verse 6 down through 8. It says, so Hathak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the edict and of the edict of the text, of the edict of their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Don't forget that last little part there. Remember, he had always told her, you go by Esther. This is the first time that he looks at her and says, you need to go and plead for your people. There's reason for that. In fact, I think there's a couple of reasons that we're going to get to in just a second. But I find it very interesting how Mordecai handles this situation. Okay, Mordecai is outside the gate. He is in sackcloth and ashes. Because of that, he is not able to come into the king's gate. That was the whole reason that Esther sent him clothes to change into, to put on. Because if he had put on regular clothes, he could have come in, she could have sat down with him and found out what was going on. But he refused to do that. Why? Because he was in wailing and in mourning just like the rest of the Jews were. And so Hathak comes out and Mordecai explains to him, and I love how he does this, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Mordecai explains exactly what is taking place. Nothing more and nothing less. I found it interesting that it told us that he shared with her the exact amount of money that Haman had offered. And instead of offering just word of mouth, instead of offering, he simply sends a copy of the edict with the text exactly like it was written for her to see. Now, why is that important? Because there comes a time in many of our lives where we tend to greatly embellish when a story comes to us, or we greatly embellish a situation. You ever met anybody who had they may have had a little sniffle one day, and when you talk to them, they are on death's bed? You ever met somebody, like that? You ever met somebody who's trying to tell you a situation and you realize that they have greatly embellished that situation? You ever talk to a fisherman who caught a fish like this and all of a sudden that thing is, we never do that, okay? That's why I post pictures of mine, okay? So, but we have this tendency, especially when we feel like we've been done unfair. We have a tendency to take the situation and make it far worse and make ourselves try to look better in the process. I was doing some counseling over this past week about that, about taking a nugget of truth mixed in with a lot of embellishment in order to try to make a situation look worse than it is, or try to make you look better or somebody else look worse. Mordecai could have very much have done that. Mordecai could have just come in but that's not the type person that Mordecai is. Remember, one of the things that we talked about that was of such importance for both Mordecai as well as Esther was their character. And we're going to see, I think here we see an incredible amount of character that comes out with Mordecai. We find it in the fact that he refuses to take the sackcloth off. He refuses to succumb to what he's got to do just to get inside that gate. He's there and he's mourning. And then the way he tells the story, he does not embellish anything. He tells the story exactly like it is. And the truth is, by telling the story exactly like it is, it was certainly bad enough. And we're going to kind of find how all of this runs through. But Mordecai's truthfulness in his explanation, and then he kind of gives this plea. And I told you, let's kind of hang on to that last little bit of that. In the very last part of that, in verse, the last part in verse 8 there, let's just read verse 8 again. It says, he also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. This is a tall order. And we're going to find out why. There's several things of reasoning why this is a tall order. And we're going to kind of hear it more from Esther's mouth in a second. But I just want to take that last little part. By Esther going in and laying claim for her people, she's admitting to the king that she has, in a sense, been living in a false identity. She's admitting to the king something that he didn't know and didn't realize, and that would be the fact that she's a Jew. I told you a second ago how Mordecai's character really shines in this. Well, now let's put, because what Mordecai asked of Esther is now going to put her character at light. Let's look at Esther's dilemma, 9 through 11. Hathak went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then he instructed him to say to Mordecai, instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Well, here's a dilemma. It's a dilemma that's huge. Queen Esther realizes in those days you could not just go before the king unless he summons you. Unless he summons you, you were not ever allowed to go into the king's presence. This was especially true, I've been reading, for females. certainly nobody was able to do that, but females especially. There was a hierarchy that took place inside of many of the areas at that time, and Susa would have been one of those, where women just could not do that. And so Esther has a dilemma. She sends back to Mordecai and says, Mordecai, if I go before the king like you've requested me to do, that I'm about to be killed. She says, he has not summoned me. In fact, she says, he hasn't summoned me in over 30 days. She says, I don't even know if the king knows who I am anymore. It's been 30 days since he's even summoned me to come in. Mordecai, if I do this, you have sealed my death. It's basically what she has to consider. Well, Mordecai gives her some incredible advice. And we're going to camp out here for just a minute. In verses 12 through 14, this is what I would say to be the pinnacle part of the book of Esther. It's a very important passage of Scripture. And so I want us to read it, and then I want to talk about it, okay? This is 12 down through 14. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position, and here's the phrase, for such a time as this. If you've ever, in fact, there has been so many women's conferences that I've seen that have been entitled For Such a Time as This. There are T-shirts out there with this on it. There are cups out there with this on it. You can find pictures with this on it there. So this has become an incredible phrase for this. But basically, Mordecai's advice comes in three segments. The first thing, in verses 12 and 13, he says, doing nothing still has consequences. Let's read what he says, and then let's talk about this. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, this is verse 12 again, he sent back the answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. He says, sometimes, how do we phrase it like this? There are people who are not very good confrontationalists. Then there are people who think they're way too good at confrontation. There's people who run toward confrontation, and there's people who would refuse to get anywhere near confrontation. Well, I think both extremes of that put you into a very difficult situation. Early in my ministry, I would have been that first guy that I didn't shy away from confrontation at all. It was what it was. I hit it head on. Here we go. Well, the older I get, I guess the more mellow I become, or I guess what happens is God really begins to do a major work in my life, and so I have become more mellow. But what the problem that Mordecai puts before Esther is this. Esther, this is not a problem you can just turn your back on. This is not a problem that you can just say, maybe it'll go away. This is not a problem, Esther, that you can just maybe hope this just going to blow over. In other words, there are many times in our life when doing nothing still has incredible consequences. We'll put it like this. It's always the right time to do the right thing. Does that make sense? Regardless of the situation, regardless of how easy it is, regardless of what's taking place, it is always the right time to do the right thing. And whenever you and I have the right thing to do, yet choose to do that which is wrong, consequences come. What if you and I know the right thing to do, but maybe we don't choose to do the wrong thing, we just choose to do nothing? Well, there's still going to be consequences. And that's what Mordecai says to Esther. He says, Esther, don't you realize the consequences are going to come with this? In other words, Esther, you're so afraid that you're going to go before the king and be killed without realizing and understanding that if you don't go before the king, you're going to be killed. In other words, it's a no-win situation. And so, Esther, you must consider this. You must think about this. Doing nothing still has consequences. But then the first part of verse 14, and I love this. Let's read it together. It says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family, it says, will perish. God's plans and purpose are not dependent on you and I being obedient. Can I say that again? Because we're going to have to pick this apart. God's plan and purpose are not dependent on you and I, whether we can get those things accomplished or not. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. Personal example. Not a personal example, but a very current example. Heard somebody, not in our church, but heard somebody say these exact words. If Donald Trump does not become president for a second term, God's will can't be accomplished in America. God's will, God's purpose is not dependent on you and I. How crazy is it to think that God is dependent on you and I as weak vessels to accomplish His purpose and His plan? There is not a single one of us that could ever do anything to thwart the purpose and the plan and the sovereign will of our Lord and Savior. Not a thing. And that's exactly what Mordecai looks at her and says. Mordecai looks at Esther and says, Esther, don't you realize if you choose not to do this? Says, don't you realize and understand that if you choose not to do this, God will raise up somebody else in your place that's going to do this? You know what scares me is the number of times that I believe that God has called me to do something and I just didn't want to do it. And so God raised somebody else up to accomplish that which God had put before me. And you know what happens? They receive all the blessings from the will of God being accomplished. And I'm miserable over here because I've stepped outside of God's will. You ever thought about that? God's will is not dependent on you and I. How arrogant of us is it to think that God needs us to accomplish His plan and His will. He doesn't need us. God is God regardless of what you and I do. By the way, can I remind you, God is God regardless of who gets in the White House. Don't ever say that God can't get His will accomplished because of anything. God is God. He is absolutely sovereign. He is absolutely omnipotent. He is absolutely God. Period. And there's nothing that will ever change that. We have the certain people we want to do this and that, and listen, we all vote in one direction or another. But God's will is never thwarted because of that. And so it brings us to the last thing that Mordecai says to her. Okay, if you and I, if our obedience is not the dictating factor with whether or not that God's will and purpose is accomplished, then Mordecai turns right around and says to her, but God in His sovereign love, and plan, has chosen us to be a part of his plan. Let me say that, and then we'll read how it does it. God does not need us to accomplish his will. But because of his grace and his mercy and his love, he has chosen us to be a part of his plan. I don't know about you, but that's really cool. You know, Ephesians chapter 1, people debate, and there's so many debates about what Ephesians chapter 1 tries to say, whether it's talking about predestined and what's that mean, and what does it mean to be part of the chosen, and you've got your Calvinists on one side, your Arminians on the other side, you've got your Calminians in the middle, kind of like me, you know, that fall onto this. But can I tell you the beauty of chapter 1 of Ephesians? I was teaching the book of Ephesians a number of years ago, and I prayed and I said, God, I've taught this before, so I'm asking you to bring out something new to me. And so I started reading Ephesians, and I got down to chapter 1 and made it all the way to verse 4 before I became absolutely broken. Because I got to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, and it said this. It says, because you were chosen in him before the foundation of the world. And I thought about that. And I thought about this fact that before God said, let there be, he chose you and I. I chose you, he said, before the foundation of the world. Before let there be, you were on his mind. You were on his heart. And he chose us to be part of this glorious plan that he's working out. I don't understand it. How many times do we sit back and say, God, we don't understand the end of this plan? Maybe he hasn't. Maybe he doesn't need for us to understand the end of the plan. Maybe he just needs for us to be faithful today. We worry so much about tomorrow that we forget to just be faithful today. So I'm going to walk day by day in obedience with him because I've been chosen for this. And Mordecai looks at Esther and just says in that last part, you know, after saying that, you know, if you choose not to do this, God's going to raise somebody else up in the place of yours. But then he says this, but who knows but that you may have come to this royal position for such a time as this. Meet the sovereign hand of God. That's it right there. That is Mordecai realizing and expressing to Esther that, Esther, you may have thought that you won this great Persia beauty contest. You may have thought, but Mordecai says, but we need to just back up and realize that God has been at work through every bit of this. Remember I told you that one of the reasons that the book of Esther was not going to be included in the canonization was because it did not contain the Word of God. And I told you, though it may not contain the Word of God, it certainly contains the hand of God. Meet the hand of God in the end of verse 14. We've seen it all throughout the book, but it is absolutely evident right here. Mordecai looks at Esther and says, but Esther, I want you to think back over the last 7-8 years that you've been in the citadel. Think about everything that's happened. Think back to the time when you were just going through beauty treatments and you won the pleasure of the eunuchs at that time. And then think about the fact that you won the pleasure of all the other ladies in the beauty contest. So that everybody in the beauty contest was also cheering for you to win. Think about that, Esther. Esther, do you not see that God was at work? And perhaps, Esther, God has put you in this position right now for this purpose. And the dilemma that hits Esther is this. You can either stand to be a part of God's plan, or you can step aside and somebody else will do it. What if God is saying to you and I, I've got you in this place for this purpose, for this reason. In the middle or at the end of 2020, with COVID going everywhere, with an election that's in an uproar, with civil disobedience and civil upheaval going everywhere. I've got you in the middle of this for a purpose and for a plan. And what I need you to do is not figure it out. I just need you to be faithful to what I've called you to do. Perhaps we've been brought together for such a time as this. You believe in the sovereign hand of God, which I do. I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that God is in absolute sovereign control. That makes him God. I also believe that in the midst of his absolute and his sovereign control, that there's a bunch of us crazy people that are running around trying to figure out that which God never meant for us to figure out in the first place. God doesn't look at us and say, I need you to have the answers. He looks at us and says, just be obedient. And that's tough. So now we get down to this last little part. We got to look at Mordecai's character. Now let's look at Esther's character. And there's two parts to this. And let's close with this. This is 15 through 17. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And look at this last part. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Let me give you two parts to her character, and we're going to see more of her character come out through this. But here's two parts. First of all, she wanted to be spiritually ready to go into this situation. I love that part. She could have just sent word to Mordecai and said, all right, Mordecai, let's see what happens. Here we go. She doesn't do that. She sends word to Mordecai, and she says, Mordecai, I need you to go throughout all the provinces, and I need you to tell every one of our brothers and sisters, every one of us Jews, you need to tell every one of them to start, and for 3 days, we're going to fast and pray. Then she looks and says, and Mordecai, for those 3 days, I'm going to be doing the exact same thing. Why? Because she knew that she was about to walk into the middle of a spiritual battle with which she knew that she needed to spiritually be prepared. I think there's too many times that we outpunt our coverage. We jump up and think, I can handle this situation. And we get in the middle of it and we realize, oh, I can't handle this situation. Remember the Old Testament? When they're wandering through the wilderness and they griped. They griped because they were hungry. God gave them manna. They griped because they were thirsty. God sent them water from the rock that was there. Then they griped because they didn't like the manna anymore. They wanted meat, so God sent them meat. Then they griped and said, why didn't you just leave us on the other side of the Jordan? Then they griped. I mean, God's people gripe a lot. Don't we? I mean, let's just be honest. We just gripe a lot. We're griping people. And they gripe, and Moses is that intermediator in the middle who is just worn out by all of it. Moses goes before God and says, God, right there we know the promised land is over there. We're wandering in this wilderness. Could we just please make it to the promised land? That's basically what he says. And God looks at Moses and says this, okay, I'm going to let you go. He said, but I'm not going with you. Remember that story? He said, I'm going to let you go into the promised land. But he told Moses, he says, I'm not going. In other words, he said, that's not my purpose. That's not my plan. Moses, there's a purpose and plan for with which you're in this wilderness. You may not see it right now. You may not like it right now. But there is a purpose and a plan for with which I'm working out that I don't need you to figure out right now. But he says, Moses, if you and these people want it that bad, I'm going to let you go into the promised land, but I'm not going with you. You remember Moses' response, though? Moses' response was this: I would rather stay in the wilderness with you than to go to the promised land without you. That's beautiful. Esther doesn't know the plan, but she wants to be spiritually ready. And she basically says, God, if you're in this, I'll walk with you. She said, I'm going to do this, and if I perish, I perish. But she said, I will perish with my character intact. And we have to stop there. It's a great chapter. Perhaps God has called us for such a time as this. Leave you with a story. The lady who prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed to have a job. God finally opened up a door and she got a job. She went into that workplace. She worked there for an entire week. Came in on that Sunday and the pastor said, hey, how's your new job? She said, I hate it. He looked at her and said, you hate it? And she said, yep. Those are some of the most evil, vile people I've ever been around in my life. All they do is talk ugly. All they do is the things that they say. I cannot believe that God put me in the middle of all of that. Pastor looked at her and says, where does God put lights? She didn't quite gather what he was saying. She continues on. She says, preacher, you don't understand what it's like. I mean, these people talk about their weekends. They talk about the things that they do. They talk, their language is absolutely horrible. It is just, and he just kind of stops her and says, where does God put lights? She keeps going, ranting about the job that God had given her. And as the middle of her rant keeps going, preacher stops her and says, where does God put lights? And she said, preacher, I guess God puts lights in dark places. And he looked at her and said, go to work. Perhaps God has put us in the middle of a very dark situation in our nation right now, to be a remnant that was willing to stand and say, thus saith the Lord. This isn't the first time that our world's been in turmoil. This isn't the first time that people have turned their back on God's word. This isn't the first time that the church has struggled. But every single time, God kept a remnant of people who were faithful to him. Perhaps we've been put in this for such a time as this.